Good morning, everyone. Just letting you know that we will get started at 9:05 a.m., just allowing everyone to get in from the waiting room, and we will get started then. In the meantime, enjoy our nice slideshow of our sponsors and member institutions. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience there. We just thought we would allow 5 minutes at the beginning here to get everyone in. That was trickling in, and there were quite a few people joining us over that 5-minute span, and hopefully you enjoyed those slides from our sponsors. Welcome to the 8th Annual Burning Issues Workshop and the 22nd Annual Meeting of the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council. We have an exciting lineup today as well as tomorrow, and we thank you so much for registering for this event and hope that you enjoy today. So to start, we'd definitely like to thank in advance all of our speakers and panelists that are going to make this event possible. They are all listed there. We have a wide variety of organizations represented across the organizations that we engage with as a Prescribed Fire Council. And so you will get to know each of these individuals and interact with them through panels and discussions, and then hear a little bit more about the things that they have to talk about today. So we thank all of them. We could not pull this event off without them. We also could not pull this event off without our organization and planning team for the Burning Issues Workshop. So those include myself. I am the 2021 chair of the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council. My name is Andy Vanderyacht, and I am an academic research specialist at Michigan State University in the Forestry Department. Other members of our planning team include Stephanie Deep of the Kalamazoo Nature Center, who is also employed by us, the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council. We also have Michelle Richards from Fort Custer Training Center, Jack McGowan-Stinsky of the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, Craig Meyer of the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savannah Fire Science Consortium, Amy Fry of NRCS, and Laura Judge of the Leewanee Conservation District in partnership with the Michigan DNR. So all of these individuals have been critical in pulling today's event off and planning everything that you will see today. So before we get started, a little bit of guidelines for today's events. Number one, if you have any technical difficulties at all, please note that we have many people working behind the scenes to make sure that this experience is a good one. And so it is most likely issues on your end. So I would advise logging out and logging back in and see if that helps. However, if there are any remaining technical difficulties or if you have access issues, getting kicked out, that kind of thing, please email amy.fry@usda.gov or call her at that number there. And we will also put that in the chat so that you have access to that information. But please contact her, reach out via email. It was probably the easiest way, or you can call that number and we will get you support. Also, the settings for most of you are that you will be muted and your videos are off during this event to help with bandwidth as well as focusing on the speakers that are presenting. So please abide by those rules. We do hope that all of you utilize the chat box to comment as well as submit questions during any portion of the event. And we have people dedicated to monitoring that chat box to make sure that that gets brought into panel discussions as well as question and answer periods with any presentation. So please use the chat box and feel free to use it just to comment and just to reach out to your individuals that you know within your network. You can send direct messages to kind of keep the chat box clutter down, but feel free to banter as much as you would like in that. We also note that today's sessions will be recorded and posted to various outlets, including our own website, as well as possibly the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savannah Fire Science Consortium's websites. And then finally, please watch out for an evaluation of today's event. We always appreciate feedback and ways in which we can make this event better in the future. And so we will be emailing that to the registration list as a follow-up to this event. So please be on the lookout for that. So here we are on day one of Burning Issues, but I do want to point out that tomorrow we have an equally exciting lineup. We will be covering the Brittle Fire and the lessons learned there through an exciting presentation of that event and a review of everything that had occurred, and then a panel presentation that's kind of dealing more generally on the importance of partnerships and public communication before, during, and after incidents like the Brittle Fire. So please join us for that. I think it'll be an absolutely fantastic and engaging discussion. And important for all of us in our interests related to the Prescribed Fire Council. Following that, we will do a heavy dive into Michigan's Certified Burn Manager Program with a thorough review of the past, present, and future of that program by Glenn Palmgren of the Michigan DNR, and then a panel assembled to kind of create perspectives on multiple sides of that program and its development, and that should be also an exciting panel and discussion. So that brings us today. Today's agenda, we will be largely focused on growing season burning. So several presentations related to that. We will be diving through these and have a break, and then have two more sessions and then a panel centered around growing season burning. So we will hold all of our questions till the end, and our moderators will peruse those questions as they come in through the chat box and decide if maybe some of those are more pertinent. We'll jump in with those as they may directly affect understanding of the content. However, most of those will be addressed later on in the panel from 10:50 to 11:20, where all of those individuals presenting prior to that will be assembled, and we'll have a nice little panel. We will then have a nice presentation on smoke management in Michigan by Jennifer Dixon of Eagle, and wrap up with some comments on the annual happenings within the council by myself. So with that, we will be transitioning into today's agenda, and I would like to introduce you all. First, before we transitioning into today's agenda, and I'll be introducing today's moderator. But prior to that, we thought it would be great if we could learn a little bit more about each other and where we all are, and through the interacting with this poll. So if you could answer these three questions. And do make sure to scroll down because there are three questions. You may not be able to see each of those questions. And if we could all do that, there will be a little bit of information about who's all joining us today prior to us heading off into the agenda for today. And so as we're all responding to those poll questions, I will introduce today's moderator. Craig Mayer is the coordinator of the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savannah Fire Science Consortium. He started with the consortium in 2013, and previously he earned a Master's of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2012. His land stewardship experience includes work with the Nature Conservancy, the Wisconsin DNR, and the Aldo Leopold Foundation. And Craig, as long as with Jack McGowan-Stinsky of the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, has been integral in creating today's lineup centered around growing season fire. And with that, I will pass the torch off to him, and so we can all sit back and learn a little bit about growing season fire. I would like to ask that the poll results be shared before we dive into that.
I clicked, so they should be showing.
Oh, yep, fantastic. I see that. Okay, so these are the final results. So you can see kind of a representation of where everyone is located across our state and outside of the region there. Also affiliations. It looks like we've got a good representation from federal, state agencies, nonprofits, consultants, and students. Excellent. Good representation from students. I like to see that. And then finally, how long have you been working in wildland fire? And it looks like a very equal distribution across those categories. So that's excellent. Some newbies as well as some very experienced elder statesmen of the profession. So with that, Craig, I'd love for you to let us take off.
All right. Thank you, Andy. It's been great working with Andy as the chair of the council this year and also as the chair of the planning committee for burning issues. So thank you to Andy as well for all the behind the scenes work to help make this happen. We have a great set of panelists for you today discussing growing season burns. It's really interesting to see the range of experience that we have joining here today. I think we'll have something for everyone, whether you're very experienced or new to burning. When we got our panelists together for our coordination meeting prior to this, we ended up having more than half an hour discussion afterwards. So I think the panel discussion is going to be very lively and presenting a lot of information as well. So just to reiterate, as we're going along here, feel free to type any questions into the chat. Most of those will be held until the panel discussion, unless there's like a clarifying question for one of the speakers. And then for just for logistics, again, we will have a break at 9:10 Central or 10:10 Eastern. So coming up here in about 50 minutes, we'll come back for more presentations and then the panel discussion. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. To start us off with the overview, we have Jack McGowan-Stinsky. He is currently the program manager for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. His past professional experiences include fire manager and land steward for the Nature Conservancy, a consultant contractor burn boss, multiple seasonal positions with the U.S. Forest Service and state DNRs. And additionally, Jack is one of the founders of the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council. So, thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Craig. Let me get my screen shared here. Craig, is this coming through now? Just to make sure.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to do a pretty rapid overview. And when I was thinking about doing this, it's pretty much trying to set the stage for the other folks, the other speakers coming up, because they can dive deeper into this. But again, I've been doing growing season burning for quite a few years. So part of what I wanted to do is kind of go through the thought process with that. So let's get started here. So I kind of looked at and thought about it as a paradigm shift. And my paradigm shift, and when I started thinking like a fire dependent ecosystem or what that means. So it actually started in 1987, 1988. I was working in a seasonal position with the Forest Service on a fire crew. There was actually a wildfire, and this was in northern Wisconsin. There was a wildfire. It was in July. I didn't know anything about fire then, really, so it didn't surprise me. It was just a wildfire. The aha moment was a week later. We were out on a field site visit with quite a few folks, Forest Service, DNR, you name it. And somebody asked about burning, and the actual IC who had been on the wildfire the week before said, you can't burn this in the summer. Well, I didn't speak up then because I was pretty shy then. But on the way back, I asked him what he meant. And he said, well, that was a wildfire. That's different. But that was the aha moment, because I couldn't figure out why a wildfire, prescribed fire, both require ignition, and that wildfire was burning happily away. So that got me thinking all the way through. So let's fast forward 30 plus years. And I'm going to put this up right here, present some of this right off the bat. The burns that are listed in here are not all the burns. These are just the ones that have what I considered good qualitative and quantitative data. And you can see the types of monitoring and research that kind of went into this. And so I'll clear that out of there, but you can see the range of burns. And there's a lot there, obviously, in dormant season and in summer. So again, the takeaway is not that switch your season to growing season, or that the growing season burns are a silver bullet or anything. It's more opening up that burn window. I highlighted March and October here, not because we weren't doing a lot of burning there. It's the burns were less, and it was a capacity issue. It's not that we could not burn, but it was a capacity issue. Simply, we didn't have seasonals on often, or seasonals had left. So it became a capacity issue to conduct burns. If you look at this, this is the number of units that are burned repeatedly. And this is, again, where you're going to hear me say this later on, that it's the repeated burns in different seasons that really make that dynamic change. So it's not all growing season burns that are repeated. It's not all dormant season burns that are repeated. It's the wealth of them through the years. So here we are. And I expanded out, obviously, beyond Michigan. But one thing to keep in mind is, obviously, dormant season burning does not just boom, snows off and you start burning, right? I mean, people can be burning in Michigan and in the southern portions of other states, and there might be snow in the northern portions. So keep that in mind. There's that seasonal shift, obviously, with both spring and fall or dormant season. So what is growing season? Okay, what do we define that with? And you have to kind of define it for yourself too. So it could be snow off to snow on. It could be when a certain suite of plants are actually starting to grow. You have to define what that is. But remember, it's not as if everything grows and then everything senesces either. You have your early spring growth, you have your early growing season growth, and mid and late and so on. And when you're applying anything, whether it's fire or any other management technique, you're going to either have a positive or negative effect on plants that are growing. And, you know, certain plants are more susceptible when they're flowering or fruiting or at different certain growth stages. So we had to frame it that way too. And we also got to remember that as we move through the growing season, we have an increase and then a decrease in our live fuel moisture. So that's going to factor into prescriptions, and Steve Cross will talk more about that. So just kind of throwing out the calendar year there, dates, we're going to use those generally, but keep in mind that can shift depending where you are. You know, one person's spring may be in February, the others may not start till May. So you have to determine what your dormant seasons are, what your growing seasons are based on that. You know, we're all prescribed fire practitioners, but I like to throw out, we're actually should be fire effects practitioners. And throw this comic up here. I love this with Calvin and Hobbes, because this is what we often encounter when we talk about fire, including myself. Everybody has their own perception of what fire is. And so if we get this up here, you know, we have our goals or objectives. We have different values and visions that we want to see. Ideally, they all factor into fire effects. To get those fire effects, we actually have to have fire and repeated fire, and that requires prescriptions and weather, and you actually have to implement those, obviously. But the disconnect often seems to come, are we actually achieving fire effects? And does it relate back to our objectives? So do our objectives actually meet our fire effects? Do our fire effects actually meet our objectives? A way to look at this too is that not every burn or even repeated burns are going to be perfect. You know, we learn by our mistakes. Obviously, that's how we refine when we should burn. So, the target can be your goals or multiple objectives, your values, vision, and you're launching a lot of arrows at it. And ideally, the more you do it, the better you get, or you talk with enough people and learn from their research monitoring, and you tighten that up so that you are actually achieving the objectives you want based on the fire effects that you're seeing or monitoring. So get this out there. Again, goal is not the flames, but what those flames do. So we want to get the desired fire effects. So when I started burning, and many of you may still experience this, there was a no burn or an okay to burn window. And roughly put it, let's say mid-April to mid-October is the no burn. That's often based on a variety of different species and species restrictions, whether they're rare species or you name it, nesting birds, so on. So you have this okay to burn window. But oh boy, when you're in those northern regions, you really can't burn for a portion of that. Now it depends. Obviously, we do have winters where some people are where there's no snow. So they might be able to make use of that, a longer dormant season. But if we focus on that kind of when we do have snow cover, can you do winter burning? Heck yeah. Some of these pictures are from Michigan DNR, some are from Fish and Wildlife Service, some are mine, but you can do brush pile burning, cattail burning, Phragmites burning, so on, and get good effects, whether it's reduction in fuel or actually ecological effects from that. Let's look at our dormant season burning, kind of our shoulder seasons, okay? You have potentially 60 days in there. And again, it's going to expand and decrease, but let's just use that rough estimate. But when you look at all the potential days that you have to subtract, either from a burn ban or wildfire risk days, or rainy days, and windy could also be the wildfire risk days, you actually are really reduced in the number of days you have possible. So we try to cram a lot of burning into a few days, essentially. We have a very short window. And then the barriers we have to that are compounded if we have capacity and equipment and money issues, all trying to sneak it into one window. If we look at our dormant season effects on plants, you can see right here, the population increases the arrow up, and green means it's positive, decreases if it's arrows down, and red means it's a negative. And if we look at that, we favor a suite of plants, and we do not favor another suite of plants. And if we constantly burn in one season, we potentially can lose a certain whole suite of plants with that. And when I started doing this, this is kind of where it bugged me. It's like fire doesn't always approach it that way. Flip side is if you look at our invasive species or our competitive species, you burn in the shoulder seasons, you're actually helping them along. And we may not want to do that. So you got to factor in other techniques too. So this is not just about fire. It's how you match up fire with your other management strategies. So this is kind of a take on what we call success. And often I hear people saying we need more burning, which we do. I'm not going to disagree with that, but it's also the quality of the burn. So if we're focused on just the quantity of the burn, I often tell people, well, you may as well take your money that you would spend on those burns and toss it into a metal garbage can, throw a match on it. And what do you have? You have your smoke, you have your fire, you have ashes. If you take those ashes, spread it across the landscape, you've done the same thing. You've kept your crew safe, a whole lot safer. You've achieved your acres if you've scattered the ashes out. You've spent your fire budget and you've had your little bit of flame and smoke. But the issue is, did you actually achieve fire effects? Now, you do achieve fire effects during dormant season, but that's about how you have to evaluate. So if your focus is strictly on quantity and making it black, but nothing else, then that's not that great of a measure of success. It's not really an outcome-based investment strategy. And the question is, are you working with a traditional-based organizational thinking or a learning-based organizational thinking, or are you thinking through that lens? So part of this was talking to a lot of people and doing different surveys, and I just pulled out a variety of this. So these kind of were the top hits. There's rare species restrictions, What is a good burn day? It's not recognizing what burn days are. And these all are in that summer season. What does growing season burning mean? You know, a lot of people who never burned in the summer. It's weed season. So staff have other duties, you know, or staff's needed for Western wildfire. All the prescribed fire money spent or all the equipment's put away. Hey, what is the public going to think of this? And those are all really good questions, and they are barriers or impediments. And so if you wrap those into some categories, you know, we have our rare species, wildlife concerns, our prescriptions, weather, air quality, smoke, our capacity of doing, you know, can we do burns or we need to be doing something else, our social acceptance, and it all wraps into an investment in time, labor, money, and learning too. All right, so let's pull out a couple of these, really ramp it up. So our growing season fire barriers could be our opportunities actually. And the two usually that resonate are the lack of knowledge or available information on seasonal fire effects, or our expectations for what a growing season burn is based on just with our dormant season experience. So how do we look differently at fuels, fire behavior, weather, prescriptions, mop up, and capacity? So there's a growing season burn. A lot of people would see that start and would shut it down because it doesn't look like it's going to do anything. Here's another example. This one you can actually see it's moving through, but it's a slow rate of spread. Or this one, that's a last day in July burn in a white pine, white oak system. That doesn't look that much different than kind of our dormant season, maybe a little modified fire behavior, but not much. So let's delve into this with the growing season. There's a lot of plants that obviously live in fire dependent systems and plants that need fire. So to back it up a little bit, we need to look at our energy released, our fire intensity basically, and think about fire severity. So do not forget about the fire severity part of it, because those two combined, fire intensity, fire severity, is what gets you your ecosystem response. That's both your direct and indirect effects on both the flora and the fauna. So it's the heat output at the correct time. And the candle is a great example of that, because that doesn't produce a lot of heat, but if you hold your hand over for long enough, you will feel that heat. The other thing, and hopefully Steve, you can talk more about this, but you know, do not restrict yourself or the people doing the burns specifying an exact ignition pattern. I mean, it goes into a burn plan and you estimate it, but allow that flexibility so that you can get different types of ignition patterns that'll get you different rates of spread and a longer residence time or a shorter residence time. You know, learn how to adjust your intensity and severity of those burns so you get the whole fire effects from each burn. So if we pull this back up, this table here, now you can see that we look across this whole growing season, or if we combine spring, growing season, and fall, in general, our duff and soil moisture is higher in the spring, but it does get drier and drier typically as we move into that late growing season. So our fire severity can often increase. And again, Steve Cross can talk more about that when it comes to thinking about prescriptions with that, that increased drying, whether it's duff or soil moisture. And again, don't forget that live fuel moisture concept either. So we can use seasonality to not just open our burn window, but at the same time, we can deliberately use seasonality and phenology and physiology to define or refine our prescriptions and try to get the biggest bang out of the buck out of each growing season and dormant season. So the whole burn window. So we put it up here, we know that now, if anytime we do anything, whether it's fire or a management activity or no management activity, there's always going to be some type of positive or negative impact. You got to decide if you want that or what you want out of it. But you can see now the comparison. If you start burning in the growing season, you're altering the plants that are favored, positive or negative. If we look at the invasive species, remember, if you're burning in those shoulder seasons, dormant seasons, spring or fall, you can actually help them along. But all the monitoring data shows that if you can get fire in the growing season, you're going to negatively impact most of them. You got to watch out for a couple that actually can still increase. But the majority are actually, in this case, taking fire as both an ecological process and then using it as a tool to help with that minimization or the doing the negative impacts on the invasive species and kind of knocking the invasive species down. So it makes your toolbox a little more effective if you can use fire along with herbicide and other techniques. All right, let's get into the species because again, the animal species. Obviously that is one of the biggest restrictions to opening up or growing season burns. And it can cause our restoration paralysis. Basically, we have competing values. I don't want to cause harm to any animals. I'm sure most of you don't want to cause harm to any individuals of a species. But the reality is, if we focus on the individuals too much, we actually might lose the entire habitat or the structure they need. So we go back to some basic biology. What do we need as an animal to survive? Air, water, food, shelter, and some type of space to survive. And you have to determine, obviously, each species has its own mix of that. Now, animals that live in fire-dependent systems are not carrying around a fire extinguisher or a fire shelter or anything else. They're a fire-dependent animal species because they need what fire produces in their habitat. All right. So we can also look through this lens. What else is there that can injure any of these species or kill them potentially? It could be other techniques, mowing, timber harvest, it could be vehicles, it could be predators. Fire certainly can be both a positive and negative effect. Climate change, but fire, think about this, is just one of the abiotic disturbances that are out there. There's a whole bunch of biotic disturbances too that can affect any individuals of a species, you know, whether it's tornadoes, hurricanes, rain. Rain is an abiotic disturbance factor. A little bit of rain or not enough rain can lead to drought. Too much rain can also be bad. So let's kind of put fire in that perspective of it's a needed disturbance. And we often are the ones now putting it back into a system. So fire can be really good across multiple seasons. And again, it's repeated burns to kind of get this fire dependent system back. And it typically doesn't hurt most of the plant species unless it's your non-native or the competitive. Without fire though, you're gonna likely lose that entire species or lose that system, excuse me. So if we look at it from the animal perspective and we really restrict how we use fire, which is really restricting how we use the fire effects, this is what can happen. So we may be concerned about losing individuals, but the lack of fire and the lack of the available habitat could be the greatest threat to any individuals and the entire population of the species. Now that doesn't mean if you got a really small site that you just go and burn it. You have to take it into context of scale too. All right, so we hit a lot of these lack of knowledge or available information on seasonal fire effects, but our expectations for growing season burns, just quickly go through some of these because the other ones can talk about them, the other speakers can talk about them. So again, this is what I heard. You cannot burn that in the summer. And I've heard this repeatedly, but you can. I mean, that fire is happily creeping away. So is this traditional based thinking? Are we breaking out of that and actually learning? I've heard this a number of times, quite a few times. We tried a summer burn and it did not work. So we're not going to try it again. My question back to those folks was, you mean to tell me every one of your dormant season burns worked? Because we know not every burn works and you need to learn how to adjust those. But if they said, that didn't quite work, but what do we need to do differently to make it better, make it work? Then you're shifting into learning from mistakes. So it's a learning based. We will never do a summer burn because it will be too smoky. Time and again, that comes up. I'm gonna let Trent deal with that one. But for reference in this picture, that's a dozer, okay? And if you look at that nice white smoke, Trent will tell you it's a lot of water vapor. But Trent, you'll be able to address this concern that summer burns are smoky. All right, so if we wrap that all up, we can really broaden out our burn window. And I'm gonna do just a couple more slides here. We're almost done. But one of the questions I've heard time and again is that there's just not enough weather days or days that meet prescription parameters. Well, part of it's adjusting the prescription parameters. And so here's an example. This is a pooled data from 1994 to 2012, and this is all in Michigan. And these timeframes here, you can see if April 1st, May 10th, there's 40 total days there, 26 were burn days. We move into that summer season, June 16th through August 31st, 77 total days. We had 40 days pooled. So there's actually a lot of burn days. It's again, adjusting your perception of what a burn day is and what the weather looks like and changing your prescription. So here's an example real quick, 2011 burn season. And we used everything we had learned about growing season burning and dormant season burning and tried to maximize based on objectives how many burns we could do. And so we estimated, we said we're gonna do, shoot for 79 burn units, and we're estimating it's gonna take us 114 operational days. The operational days get longer as you move into the growing season. So that is a paradigm shift. You have to think about allowing more days potentially to do one unit. We look at the actual numbers. This is what we achieved. So we did 78 burn units. So we one less than estimated. And we had 106 operational days. So we actually had really good estimates here. What you can see here though, again, reminder, because the changeover, you have live fuel moisture in, you have longer residence time. We allowed things to burn out when we could. So some of these burns, quite a few actually went into multiple days. And that's, consumptive mop up or patrol days, so on. So you have to do that paradigm shift for that. But we can propose this question here, which is more cost effective? Do you do 6 consecutive days with patrol after the ignition day? Or you try to do 6 years of burning 1 day each spring, so you're returning to that site. And if you do that spring burning or meeting your objectives, maybe you need to shift it into growing season burning. But it is something that you need to think about, is how you shift how you do your burning, your implementation. This will be the last, or one of the last slides here. So when we moved into burning in pine systems, it was less for ecological effects initially for burning in growing season. So to get this up, the concern in the pine systems is obviously it's a much more hazardous fuel when you get into that spring dip. When your needle moisture is low, your starch content is high. But if you start looking at growing season where your spring dip is coming up, you're out of your spring dip and you have live surface, green fuel basically, you're going to have lower rate of spread. We moved into that season because it was a much lower risk to do it. So it was a risk acceptance at that point. But at the same time, we were starting to get really good fire effects from moving into that season. So this kind of wraps it all up. In my experience, if you can do fire across an expanded burn window and do repeated burns, what you're doing is kind of building that new fire regime and hopefully a new tradition, and hopefully you're spreading that beyond your career. And kind of the nuggets are, if you vary the way fires are conducted each time, vary that timing, intensity, severity, and frequency, and focus on long-term effects and learn from those short-term negative impacts, you're reducing that state of high fire deficit that we're in. You're increasing your native plant diversity, increasing rare species, decreasing your non-natives. You're achieving that shifting mosaic, and you're promoting resiliency. Right.
All right. Thanks, Jack.
Sure.
So just an update on the agenda. We are 5 minutes over. So unless we end up having a couple of short presentations coming up, we're just going to add 5 minutes to everything that is on the printed agenda, and then we'll just make that up for the closing remarks is our plan. So I will put that in a link during one of our later speakers as well, just to give everyone an update, but I wanted to share that. Just for our next speaker, I'll be sharing my screen for the presentation just to help deal with some bandwidth issues. But our next speaker is going to really build on a couple of points that Jack was making. This is Steve Cross. Steve worked in the Michigan Department of Natural Resources Forestry Fire Program for 35 years, including 22 years as a fire management specialist. Since his retirement from the DNR in 2011, Steve worked 1 season for the Nature Conservancy. After that, he began working as a technical service provider for the USDA NRCS, while also providing consulting services for other landowners working with the Knaus Outdoor Restoration Company. So Steve, if you can hop in, I will start sharing my screen.
Good morning. Jack kind of hit on some of the stuff that I'm going to have in my same slides, so you'll see a little repetition here, but you know, we talk about growing season burning. I've had people tell me it's off-season burning, and I guess what you have to think about there is what resulted in fires prior to settlement. You know, there wasn't much lightning in March, April, or May historically. So as far as fire starts, before there was a whole lot of settlement, the bulk of the fires were probably started by lightning in the summer. So that leads, you know, open question of when is the burning season, and at that time. But now you have to think about, at least I do, is when does a growing season start and when does it end? And Jack kind of had some slides on that. And I kind of figure, I've always figured, you know, when stuff is really starting to grow, you've got all your leaf development out, the majority of your grasses are established, most of your forbs are come up and established, and they're even starting to get some blooming. But now what I'm seeing is, and where I live anyway, we'll say northern Michigan, it used to be we had frost right up till Memorial Day weekend, and killing frosts in many cases. So, you know, the growing season might have been a little bit later starting in the past than it is now. The last few years, we've had very little late spring frosts. And the same thing goes in the fall. You know, I usually figured by September, we're going to have a good killing frost, usually at that first full moon around the 1st of September. This last year, the first killing frosts were towards the end of October. So you get a real change at that point. So what I base this session on is it's a burn that we did on a hunt club here in northern Michigan in 2000. And we can go to the next slide. And this is part of one of the units that we burnt on that day. There's kind of an old stump fence row there along a food plot. And then there's a mixture of warm season grasses and some sweet fern and other low woody shrubs. The next slide. And this is kind of the mix in the second view, where this slide, you know, basically you're looking at a couple of different fuel types in that. she started getting into some woody stuff, some mixed pine oak, some bracken fern. Okay, what is the objective? Can we meet the objective with growing season conditions? You know, you always have to think about the higher live fuel moistures. You know, are you gonna be able to get enough heat to do what you want it to do? And you have got the potential for drier heavy fuels in a drier organic layer where you might get a lot of holdover fire that you really don't want. And then Jack had the slide about all the species that you have a potential to impact, and they all seem to emerge when we start having warmer conditions. Okay. Jack had this slide too. And I guess the only thing I would question on this after burning the last few years is the warm season grasses with September burning. We burnt warm season grasses early in September now, and we burnt late September in the last few years. And we've really seen some good response the next spring. I mean, just about like burning in the July, August period, or even sometimes you might get as good a result as in April and May. And we actually had a burn in July a couple of years ago, and it shows that as being a kind of a negative impact on the warm season grasses. We actually burnt that same unit this last spring after just 2 years. And there was a heavy, thick fuel load there. And I would have to say that even with that July burn that year, that we had real good development and growth in the grasses. So. Okay, what are we going to do to develop our growing season prescriptions? You know, there's the Canadian system out there, and there's the NFDRS based system. You know, it's personal choice based on training and background. You know, the Canadian system had fuel types and versus the fuel models in the national system. And there's web-based information available for both systems. I guess on the national system, they make a kind of a couple of fuel modeling predictions early in the week, each week, that kind of show seasonal dryness, where it's at with grass development stuff. And the Canadian system, I'm hooked on. I really am. So I'm going to go to the next slide. You know, you have the Canadian forest fire behavior prediction tables and fuel types readily available on the internet. Daily, there's those forest fire danger rating system puts out projections for fire behavior for the day. That's available on the Meso West Great Lakes Fire and Fuel site. Reporting stations are widespread across the state. Usually you can find a reporting station within at least 20 miles of your burn site. In a lot of cases, it's less than that. We've got 2 different sites that we burn that were within a couple of miles of a reporting station. But the information is updated daily for fine fuel moisture, the FFMC, the Duff moisture code, the DMC, the drought code, spread index, the ISI, and build up the BUI. And those predictions are all made on the weather projections for a local area from the National Weather Service. There's some interaction there that happens every day. So every day you should have a 4 p.m. observation for whatever station you're using for your burn site. And sometimes the next morning I notice a difference in they kind of provided an update. And I don't know if that is automatic or how that works. Should have to talk to somebody from the DNR or the Forest Service that's a little bit more familiar on what they're doing now. Prescription factors and parameters. Jack talked about plant physiology and the seasons of the year a little bit. There's the limit of, what do you want to protect for your valued species? You also have to think about what you want to do about desired fire effects. As far as impacts on mammals, insects, snakes, amphibians, kind of over the years, I've kept track, not in writing, but what I seem to see across the sites that we've been burning since I've retired is it seems like if you're going to impact snakes, it's usually going to be with those late April, early May burns. And whether they're still sluggish then and they don't get out of the way. As far as nesting birds, I haven't noticed too much effect on ground nesting birds, songbirds in that time period, but turkey nests and duck nests usually are affected with those late April, early May burns if they've nested in your unit. So, let's see. We talk about what kind of parameters in the Canadian system were considered when you talk about what's your fuel consumption is going to be, what kind of residence time you're going to have in the duration of the burn. You're going to want to look at your duff moisture code, your buildup index, and your drought codes when you're developing prescription. There's some guidelines there, suggested guidelines. The DMC, usually should be below 40 in the spring. I usually look for it to be up to about 25 if I want to impact woody stems, if you're burning in the understory. But later you want to think about the BUI values. They're talking about being below 80, and you have to remember that the way the system's set up and how there's adjustment in the summer to reduce the fire danger based on the fuel moistures is when it gets up to 90 for your buildup index, you're going to roll back to a spring criteria. So what might be a high day with a BUI of 80, you bump up into get over 90, you might be looking at a very higher extreme. So it would limit your potential to burn. Drought code values below 400 in the summer. I usually try to keep mine below 300. I usually look at that as kind of a upper limit rather than the 400. And as I talk about what happened on this burn, I'll tell you why. Flame lengths, you want to make sure you have some upper and lower limits, and part of that would be based on firefighter safety. If you're working on a burn basically with hand tools and small equipment, don't have any kind of mechanized plowing equipment, about 4 foot is what you want to look at as far as firefighter safety. Any higher than that, and it's going to become an issue. And you also want to think about what are you going to do to your overstory if you have too much flame length, you increase the intensity, you're going to start having some mortality in your overstory. Your crown scorch could impact everything from pines to shrubs and brush and young trees. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, here we're looking at what the fuel consumption might be, and I think you would want to think about what do you want to do to meet your objective. You know, if you're burning on the shrublands and you want to set a bunch of that back, you know, it gives you a suggested range across the top of where you would want to be, you know, and what your upper values would be. You know, if you're looking at dry fuels and really want to set a lot of that back, you know, say you want to set back 50 to 60%, you're going to want to have a fairly dry prescription with your FFMC values in that 88 to 91 range. Your buildup index in that 50 to 100 range, and then it shows that drought code at 3 to 400. And I guess looking at the shrublands, are we going to have much issue with organic fuels there? If it's not going to be the case, you know, you can look at, yeah, I will bump up and burn in a higher, drier condition for my drought code rather than holding it down a little bit. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is the beginning of our ignition operation on that day, and we started in kind of a shaded area to see how things are going to go, and you can see what kind of fire behavior we were getting there. You know, flame lengths less than 2 feet, and we were using a backing firing pattern at the time to develop black line along our constructed dirt line. Okay, when I think about firing, you know, to maximize your impact and have a longer residence heat time, you want to look at, you know, a flanking type fire where you're firing into the wind, or backing. You know, do you want to back it and to create a slower, more consuming type of fire? But you know, it's one thing I'll say about in the summer is, you know, you better be utilizing a range of ignition patterns. Be thinking about that. You know, be creative. You know, if you get hit in those areas that just plain won't carry, I usually tell the guys, hey, let's do a little dot grid here and just go through and pick the spots where there's fuels that you know will burn. The drawback on this is you do end up with a lot of areas where you don't have complete black, and then you have to think about, well, what's the potential here if I have some holdover fire in a pile or in the ground of the stuff drying out enough to burn at a later date. Okay, go to the next one. Next slide. Okay, the conditions on the burn day. This site was a hunt club in northern Michigan, so it was kind of between two weather reporting stations. One of them was about 15 miles away and the other one about 20. You can see the FFMC was right up there to produce a good day, you know, was 90 to 91. The DMC was in that below 60 range. The drought code was well below 200. The ISI was, this is a good range for summer type burn, too high for what you'd want to deal with in the spring. The BUI was up in the 60s, thinking of what was suggested in the earlier table. And then the fire weather index, or what the fire danger was for the day, was high to very high. The National Weather Service forecast, called for 85 to 90 degrees, 30 to 38% of RH, southeast winds 5 to 10. The smoke dispersion was supposed to be excellent, and overnight humidity recovery was going to be in the upper 90s. What we ended up with on site was we had temperatures in the mid 80s. The RH was 42 was the low, and the winds were southeast 3 to 6 at eye level. And what the forecast was for the next day was lower humidity and poor smoke dispersion for the day. What we saw is the slash on that day, the consumption was well over the 60%. Talked about, we had shaded oak leaf litter late in the day, wouldn't hardly carry. We needed a lot of extra lighting, and it still wouldn't carry.
And Steve, I can give you one more minute to conclude.
Okay. And this is immediately a post-burn site, so you can see how it burnt that end where we're doing the lighting. And here's the next slide. This is another post-burn day of. You see we had a little bit of crown scorch on the lower level and the edge of this red pine plantation. Okay, then for the next slide. We did work on this mopping up for 5 days. So looking at the table Jack had on the amount of time spent on a site was a little bit over what he was predicting is about 2 days. So, but we probably could have went to more of a monitoring thing rather than full mop up after the next day. But we had people out there because we didn't have any rain showing up in the 10-day forecast. This slide here is a post-burn shot from August 3rd, and the burn was actually done on June 30th. So this was following a couple of rains, good soaking rains. You can see the setback we had on the woody shrubs, which you can also see some of the emerging plants coming in after the fact. Next slide. Next slide. Yep, this is another post-burn photo taken on August 3rd. You can see some carex species coming in, some shrubs that were impacted. This slide is some of the heavy fuel consumption, some starting to burn out in the ground and increasing the mop up time. Next slide.
All right, we're gonna have to stop there, Steve, and move on to Trent, but I think we'll get back to some of this in the panel discussion.
Okay.
All right, thank you. All right, well, thank you, Steve. Our next speaker is Trent Wickman. Trent's going to be talking about smoke management. He is an air resource specialist with the U.S. Forest Service Eastern Region. Trent grew up in northern Minnesota and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He attended Michigan Tech University in Houghton and received a BS in biology and an MS in environmental engineering. After graduation in 1996, he worked as an air permit engineer for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency for 5 years, drafting and issuing air permits for new industrial sources. Since 2001, he has worked with the U.S. Forest Service as an air resource specialist, primarily in the states of Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, assessing the impact of air emissions from industrial activities to forest resources, and also supporting wildland fire through various smoke management activities. Since 2014, he has been detailed to numerous wildfires across the US as an air resource advisor to do smoke forecasting and monitoring. Trent is based in Duluth, Minnesota. Thank you, Trent.
So a question, can you see, what can you see? What am I sharing?
Let's see, right now we see your PowerPoint, but you're not in presentation mode there.
Okay, let me see here. You know, Craig, I might have you do it because I'm going to sit here and putz around trying to get the screen to flip.
Okay, hold on one second.
Why don't we just do that? Great. All right, I assume everybody can still hear me. Appreciate everybody being online today. I see we got a big crew. Always appreciate getting together with the Michigan folks. I spent a lot of time in Michigan and enjoy all the people that I've met over the years. So I guess the genesis of this whole talk is a conversation I had with Jack not long ago, where he made the point that he had made in his talk that people talk to him and say that they can't burn in the growing season because of the smoke. And when I heard that, I was scratching my head and said, why? What specifically is it that is the issue? And Jack and I didn't get any farther in the conversation. I'm not sure he even knew or was communicated to him what the specific issue is, but I wanted to try to address this head on because I've been involved with some growing season burns, and to me, there's no difference. Nothing changes. When you flip a page on the calendar, nothing changes. And that's sort of the take-home point that I want to get to everybody on this. So if you can go to the next slide. So what I wanted to do is kind of take us back to fundamental principles here. And I borrowed some slides from RX 410. I've taught that class about 15 times and over the years. And I mean, this is one of the greatest slides, I think, in the whole class, because it kind of shows the steps you need to go through to do smoke assessments. You know, it starts with black acres, not project acres, but what we're actually going to blacken. We need to look at the fuel loads and then also the fuel consumption. Emission factors are already determined, and then we just run the models and go forward from there. So as you look at this and think about, okay, what's changing as we turn the page on the calendar in this process? Because this process is going to be the same, no matter if we're burning in April or July or October. It's the same process. So let's go to the next slide. So again, let's think about this. We're thinking about combustion and consumption, and especially consumption. And consumption is affected by those factors on that slide: loading size, arrangement, continuity, and fuel moisture. So which of these things is going to be different when we flip the page on the calendar? Now, I think we can make some, obviously some observations. Fuel moisture is going to be different. But some of this other stuff, maybe not. But, fuel moisture is a big thing that I would look at. And the models are built to handle that. So let's go to the next slide. If you remember from your RX 410, we take then the fuel consumption, and we talked about those factors that affect fuel consumption. We multiply it by an emission factor, and we get emissions. So again, as the fuel consumption goes down because we have higher moisture, then we're going to have higher fuel moisture. We're going to have less emissions in that case. Now, we may have some water vapor too, but again, I would say that the models are good at handling that. And even if they aren't, consider this: even if our emissions are off, let's say our emission estimates are low by some percentage. Remember that all these things that we do in a smoke model, the saying I always use is all models are wrong, some models are useful. we can't expect that everything when we get to the end of the process, our models are going to be plus or minus 5%. There's always going to be some form of error. And so even if we're off on our emission estimates, nothing is going to change on our transport and how we actually model the smoke moving in the atmosphere. So if we're maybe a little bit low on the one end, that's not to say that our transport and everything else we do with smoke management is off too. So, and the other thing is, as we've talked about, the more experience we get in doing this, the more we'll learn. And again, none of these models are exactly right anyways. So let's go to the next slide. Again, I've kind of hammered on this, but we turn the page on the calendar. What does it mean? I grabbed some weather data from last year, and this is in northern Minnesota. Just grabbed this one. And if you look at the fuel moisture on the far left slide, and that's all the way through the year last year, and you start in March and go all the way to October, you can find similar time periods of similar moisture all throughout the year. And also looking at the Duff moisture code and the drought code, and you can see we have the parameters there. The red is the max, and the green is the min, and the average is the blue, and then the black line is what happened last year. As you look across there, depending on whatever code your number you're looking for, you can find that all through the year. So kind of we're kind of hammering some of the same points you've already heard. Just because you change the calendar doesn't mean the fundamental processes of fuel moisture, fuel consumption change. So let's go to the next page or next slide. So thinking about this kind of in more of a generic sense, things are different, yes, maybe, but then again, they're similar. And if one of the fundamental principles of air quality management is figuring out who the sensitive receptors are in your area, and you can really boil it down to this definition: the young, the old, and those with cardiovascular respiratory problems. So let's think about that. Maybe comparing in your mind a burn in April versus a burn in July. What's different? Well, school's probably out in July. So your sensitive receptors are probably moved around as far as the young people. Now, maybe there are daycare facilities or something that become more important in the summer than maybe in the spring, but you would know your community better to know how that kind of changes. But that would be a change, I would think. Another thing to think about is rec areas, parks, city, county, state parks, and those kind of places. Maybe they're not even open in April. Obviously, they'd be open in July. So again, thinking about how your sensitive receptors move around is important, but not anything that's any harder in July than it is in April. They're just in a different spot. And then also, I think in the summer, as we get into the summer, we probably have more big events like weekend events and festivals and things to think about. But again, this is just something to be aware of. It's nothing that's insurmountable. And another thing is I thought about the difference between spring and summer or fall is that especially in Michigan, but everywhere in the 3 states that I work in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, we have lake breeze issues. And obviously the Great Lakes are a large example of that, but we also have large inland lakes where I've been involved in seeing lake breeze issues. So one thing to think about is, especially on the inland lakes, that confounding lake breeze that can really kind of, have a little micro scale meteorology and kind of maybe mess up some of the generic or general wind patterns and general weather patterns, tends to weaken or even disappear, at least on the inland lakes in the summer. So that's almost a tip of the hat for maybe somewhat easier situation. So just a couple other comments, and then I think I'll help us get a little bit back on track. Just a couple parting comments. I was thinking about public perception, and that's a big part of smoke management. As you think about, the neighbors and the situation that we live in our culture in Upper Lake states versus, say, the southeastern United States or other places. Obviously, our part of the world, people aren't used to seeing smoke necessarily. Just the fact that they see smoke sometimes is enough to get people excited. But we have an opportunity here after last summer. I call it the summer of smoke 2021. We had massive smoke impacts across Minnesota into Wisconsin, and I know the UP got it. I assume that it made it down to lower Michigan somewhat. And it really, I see this as an opportunity because this is the first time that people had to really engage with smoke and heavy smoke that lasted multiple days. You know, people aren't used to seeing smoke in our part of the country. And the fact that it got here and stayed and really impacted people's lives, I think is a talking point for us. It gives us an open door to walk in and start having the discussion about, hey, you know what, we might put up some smoke for a day, but the reason we're doing this is because of all the great reasons you can explain, for ecological reasons or fuel reduction to prevent wildfires. It's an opportunity. It's a real opportunity. So I think we need to take advantage of that. And the other point I wanted to make is be proud of your smoke, own your smoke. Your smoke's your calling card. Too many people want to just hide. They want their goal, overall goal with doing a burn is hide their smoke. Hopefully nobody sees it, and that's a win. If nobody sees it and they can kind of hide, it's good. I think that's not the way to look at it. I think what you want to do is be proud of your smoke, own your smoke. When your smoke goes up, that's your calling card. And that's your opportunity to have conversations with people about why you're burning and what you're doing. Obviously, we don't want to drop the smoke into a community and be negligent about it, but whatever you're doing, more than likely people are going to see your smoke, and just own it. So anyways, that's all I have. Hopefully got us a little bit back on time, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Well, thank you, Trent. Let's see. So we'll go on to break now. We'll plan to come back at 9:30 Central, 10:30 Eastern. So that is an adjustment from the schedule, but that will still give us 8 minutes for a break. So thanks so much to our presenters this morning. We'll have 2 more presentations after the break, and then the panel discussion. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you back here in 8 minutes. All right, everyone, welcome back from the break. For this, to wrap up the growing season burn session here after the break, we have 2 presentations from practitioners from essentially opposite ends of Michigan. So I think those are going to be really interesting. And then we will get into about half an hour for the panel discussion. So again, please keep entering any questions in the chat, and we'll be taking a look at that and pulling it in for questions in the panel discussion. So thanks everyone for your attention so far. So to introduce our next speaker, we have Lorraine Sproul. She's a natural resources supervisor at Metro Parks Toledo with 20 years of experience in natural resources management. Her focus has been on restoration efforts in the globally rare and fire-dependent habitats of the Oak Openings region. She is an Ohio certified prescribed fire boss and leads and participates in Metro Parks and regional prescription fire programs. So thank you, Lorraine.
Okay, now I should be unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Looking
All
good.
right. Okay, good morning. I'm excited to be here today. And basically, they just wanted me to talk a little bit about kind of our experience at Metro Parks with the growing season burn. So this was new for us. We've been burning at Metro Parks since 1988, but all of our burns had been either those fall or spring fires. And so just regionally, we've been talking a while about expanding that window. And so I will just kind of briefly talk about our experience that we have had. Oh, for some reason, sorry, I have some technical difficulties. I can get, for some reason, it's not allowing me to advance my PowerPoint.
You might be able to right click and hit next, or there might be some really faint buttons in the lower left corner. Yep, a little further left.
You see it? Oh, right there?
Yep.
Okay, gotcha. So we're working in the Lake Plain Oak Openings region of Michigan and Northwest Ohio. So you can see how the bulk of this region is actually up into Michigan. Through the Green Ribbon Initiative, we're working to expand our protection in this region. And then the Metro Parks of Toledo is obviously in the Ohio portion of this region. So the habitats in this region is home to 5 imperiled habitats, and all of these imperiled habitats are fire dependent. And then beyond that, if we're not working in one of these imperiled habitats, what we would have is at least an oak dominant habitat. So whether or not it's our actual oak woodlands, which are also fire dependent. So basically, we've just experienced this need for this expanded window. So where did that need come from? If you look at this image, you can see how fragmented the system that we're working within is. So along with that fragmentation means that we have a lot of really small fire units. The fragmentation also means that we have a lot of really degraded habitats. Our frequency, because of that degradation, the frequency of fire that we need is increased to actually get those degraded habitats to a space that is more maintainable. The other thing is that we know, one of the things that because these are really diverse habitats, we're really focusing on increasing and maintaining diversity. So we know that by burning in the spring and fall, we're always selecting for those same species. And then the other big thing that we have is this encroachment of woody vegetation, whether it's native or invasive. So we have a really high encroachment of woody species. And then also the other thing that we're experiencing as we're maintaining a lot of these high quality habitats, we're also having more densities of these kind of climax matrix species, such as like our big blue stem and Indian grass. So just like Jack, we experienced exactly the same challenges that Jack really highlighted. For me, probably the biggest challenge is that change in mindset. I'm just not thinking about fire during the growing season. So really getting my brain to start looking at the weather and start thinking about, what changes we need to make and what might be a good fire day. That's really required a big change in mindset for me. Because I don't have the experience, wasn't really sure of what weather I was looking for. So, what am I looking for? What site conditions do I need to know that we're going to have a successful burn? There's the classic just conflicting priorities. Usually, we're doing a lot of vegetation management, growing season management, which is always a high priority. So kind of shifting gears there. One of the big things is really changing that outreach story. So for the last 20 plus years, we've been talking about prescribed fire as this fall and spring management activity. So, and we've been successfully doing that. And I believe that our community really has accepted and they trust our fire community in the Toledo area. But what are they going to think, and how do we change that messaging so that we're including growing season burns? The other challenge is just being ready. A lot of the gear that we use, as far as our trucks, we can't have the tanks in the trucks ready, or our skids in the trucks. We can't have we actually use the same skids in our mules for herbicide. So we actually use herbicide in our skids. So making sure that we're ready so that we can get the herbicide out, get everything cleaned out so that we can use those skids for fire. So So in embracing that challenge, one of the things we have been able to do is there's a picture here of our burn trailer. So we have been able to get a burn trailer. I know the Nature Conservancy in the Green Ribbon Initiative area also has a burn trailer. So just kind of setting ourselves up so that we have things more ready, so that those other things that we need to get ready, we can just focus on kind of the basic tools. The other thing was just training and qualifications. But the positive is in the summertime, we're full staffed. So even though we don't necessarily have or have not always had all of our seasonals trained, we are full staffed. So we have some positives there. The other thing is just kind of making sure that we're doing the research so that we're getting the gains, reaching the goals of our growing season burns. And then just like Jack had mentioned, just what are these wildlife impacts? So we have some really good connections with local universities and the Toledo Zoo. So we're doing a lot of research on box turtles. If we have a Fish and Wildlife grant or any kind of federal grant, we are definitely fighting some restrictions like our bat burn windows and stuff like that. So once we realize that this is definitely something that we want to do, the next question is, okay, so where do we do it? So we decided our site selection, we decided to do Mary Savannah, which is an area that we've been burning since 1988. It's gone through a lot of changes since 1988. In 1999, we started doing actual oak savanna restoration. So we started to remove some canopy. The challenge with our oak savanna restoration has always been, we probably don't remove enough trees because we're a little bit gun shy when it comes to removing too many trees. So although you can see in that picture up in the right, we'd removed a lot of trees and we were starting to get sunlight in the canopy. We really weren't getting that the forb densities and maybe some of the grass densities that we would expect in an oak savanna. And then in 2010, we had a tornado. So the tornado went through that area. So at the bottom, you can see 2006 and then 2012, what the area looked like. And so at that point, we were getting plenty of sun, but the challenge that we had there is that our oak regeneration just skyrocketed. And so we were really fighting our native species, our native woody species. So this is just a really brief a brief history of some of the fire activity recently. So the area is about 40 acres, and in spring of 2015, we burned the entire unit. And then in the fall of 2016, we also burned the entire unit. So we kind of tried to do a spring and fall, almost back-to-back burn to see if we could start to get some control on those woodies. And then in October of 2019, we did kind of a growing season burn. It certainly acted like a growing season burn, although I don't know that we would have, because it was so late, I wouldn't say we would have gotten the effects that we would like to get out of a grow burn. But you can see here, this is what actually burned. So this is what was patchy. This is how patchy our burn was at that time. And then in August of 2020 is when we did our real growing season burn. And what we burned that year was the area. You can see there's like a purple line, that there's a purple trail basically that divides this line in half. So this unit in half, and we burned that northern portion of the unit. And then those yellow boxes are actually permanent monitoring plots that we have in this unit. And these plots have been monitored since the 90s. And then this was kind of an accident actually, but in April of 2021, we burned the entire unit again. And so these are just some photos of I'm going to go through some photos of kind of what this looked like for us. So you can see how patchy the burn was. I would not consider that it was any smokier really than any of our typical burns. So one of the challenges that we have at Metro Parks, talking about just the challenges of training, it came became very evident early on that we were going to have to change those ignition patterns and that we were going to have to do a lot of ignition because it was so patchy, to find those fuels that would actually ignite. And we don't have, once we put all of our trained staff as burn boss and as line bosses, we don't have a lot of extra really experienced staff to put as igniters. So that's definitely a gap that we have, because typically I don't like to throw my igniters into a unit unless I know that they're experienced. So we did have to go through the unit a lot because we have the same igniters having to cover a lot of area. So again, this is, you can kind of see how patchy the burn was. You can see some of the impacts on maybe some of the macro invertebrates. And then these are some really good slides or some examples of how patchy the burn was. But where we had good fire, it burned really, really well. So although it was patchy, I think in spots we had really, really good fire effects. These are some images where you can see how much heat was getting up into the canopy. You can see the change in the color of the canopy. So it was hot. I mean, we definitely had some good hot fire. And this is, again, what we're really trying to do is control some of these woody species. So this is some of the woody resprouting that we had a month later. So again, because we at least had some long-term monitoring plots in here, we were able to at least look at the data. We don't have anything to compare it to really because we haven't done enough burning of this growing season burning, but you can see how it impacted that tree layer. So our trees are defined as any species with a stem of greater than or equal to 1 centimeter of DBH. So in this, you can see how those stems were reduced. So with the black oaks, they were reduced from 280 stems per hectare to 40 stems per hectare. The black cherry were essentially eliminated as far as that actual tree layer. The sassafras was reduced 7-fold. So the expectation was that we would have resprouting, which we did, and that can be seen in here. So what happened is that over that tree layer then converted to that understory layer. So here you can see this plot was the data was collected in 2020 prior to the grow burn, and then in 2021. So you can see how our species richness did increase from 39 to 44. Our cover, our just percent cover increase, and that was based mostly due to that conversion of that tree layer to the understory layer. But some of the interesting things, you can see how some of the forb diversity definitely increased. It didn't have any impacts on our blueberry, but it did have impacts on huckleberries. So the huckleberries, were at 15% in 2020, but in 2021, down to 3%. But another thing that's interesting is the impacts that it had on the Ohio listed species. So it went from 12.7% up to 17.4%. So one of the takeaways that we had is that on these high conservation value or priority species, we did have either they at least maintained density and cover, or we had increases. Now, one thing that we did notice, this picture on the left are all of our lupin babies. So if we compared the areas that we burned, so again, this area was also burned with just a spring burn. The entire unit had a spring burn. The areas where we also had a grow burn, we had a huge flush of germination of the lupin species that we didn't see in the area where we only did the spring burn. so that's all that I have. My contact is here, and then Scott Abella helped me with the photos, and he's the researcher that we worked through. He works at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So a lot of the actual data I got from Scott.
All right. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Lorraine.
Mhm.
We'll see you back for the panel discussion. All right. Our last presentation this morning is going to be a team presentation by Carly Lappin and Henry Sullivan from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Carly is the North Central Wisconsin District Ecologist for the Wisconsin DNR's Bureau of Natural Heritage Conservation based in Rhinelander. She provides consultation for state lands and habitat management on state natural areas in a 9-county region, including several pine barrens and bracken grassland properties in the Northeast Sands ecological landscape. In addition, she participates in rare and listed species surveys, research, and management. In particular, Carly leads a long-term research and monitoring project for the state threatened wood turtle. Henry Sullivan is a forestry team leader for the Wisconsin DNR based in Florence. In his current position, he supervises forestry staff in Florence, Forest, and Langlade counties. He has worked for the Wisconsin DNR for 24 years, conducting field operations in the forestry, fire, and prescribed burn programs. So thank you, Carly and Henry.
Thanks, Craig. Can you see my PowerPoint?
No, I just see your video so far.
Okay, let's do this. How does that look?
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so we're gonna share our story of kind of getting started with growing season burns in Northeast Wisconsin. I've been working at Spread Eagle Barren State Natural Area in Florence County for 8 years now, and Henry has been there and working on the prescribed burn program on the property for 24 years now. The state natural area is located just across the Menominee River from Iron Mountain, Michigan, and Florence, Wisconsin is just to the northwest. It's an 8,400 acre property, and we have over 2,500 acres in burn units. So those are outlined in black here. This map kind of shows, well, it does show our management goals for the property and how they line up with our burn units presently. There's about 1,300 acres of the property along the Pine River, which bisects north-south there. That's owned by We Energies and is an easement, conservation easement. It's managed as part of the state natural area. The SNA protects an extensive landscape of bracken grasslands and barrens and a mosaic of other natural community types. It's important in our forested landscape in Northeast Wisconsin for species that require large expanses of open vegetation. We do have upland sandpipers on the property. Our annual management program includes lots of things other than prescribed burning, or in addition to prescribed burning, such as brush mowing and roller chopping, herbicide treatments, and timber sales. So there's a lot going on annually here. This property also has a really long history of burning. We're fortunate for that because the neighbors have, all experienced this for a long time. Barrens management in this area dates back to the 1950s. The site was initially managed as a wildlife area and leased by the DNR from Florence County. So it was originally owned by the county and was acquired and formally designated by the DNR as a state natural area in 1995. The first prescribed fire at Spread Eagle Barrens was in the 50s, and in the late 70s, the official prescribed burn program started. Since then, there have been 104 burns on the property, and we average about 250 acres per year. Although we're trying to increase that number. The most we've ever burned in 1 year was in 2019. We burned just over 700 acres. Historically, the burn season has always been what we would maybe call early growing season or late spring. So late May into early June, typically that Memorial Day weekend timeframe when our aspen is just starting to leaf out. So we haven't done much fall burning on the property. The weather in the fall is difficult to work with our short days, and heavy frost and heavy dew, and not enough drying time typically. So primarily we've always burned in late spring. Starting in the last couple years, we've been interested in expanding our burn window for a couple of different reasons. One is that, we'd like to see more acres burned annually. Our goals on the property are to expand our barrens and increase the number of burn units that we have on the property and the size. But we need to be able to keep up with what we're managing now before we can do that. And so we'd like to see more acres burned annually, and also account for reduced opportunities in the spring and early summer because of, variable weather patterns. There's also some ecological objectives for wanting to try some growing season burns. The first is to reduce impacts on sensitive species. So, most habitat managers would agree that late May and early June is not an ideal time to burn because of sensitive birds and mammals, and so on and so forth. And we do get complaints from the public when we burn in this time frame. We're also trying to improve woody vegetation control. So, burning during the summer growing season has shown improved woody vegetation control and also increased species diversity. So, burning repeatedly in late spring really promotes some species over others. And we're interested to see how this might change with growing season burning. So last summer, I kind of floated the idea and we worked with Jack McGowan Stinsky. He came down to the property for a day and talked with our fire staff. And we kind of, had a really good meeting about what our options were and what we could expect. So when we started planning this, the idea for our first growing season burn was to keep it easy. So easy meaning a relatively open unit that wasn't especially brushy. We were looking at both of the units that are on this map called the dogleg and the boot. The boot is the one we ended up burning. We burned it on August 17th, 2021. And our objectives for the burn were to top kill 25 to 50% of the woody vegetation in the unit and reduce surface fuels by over 50%. So Henry's going to talk about the actual burn.
Sure. Steve talked a bit about in his presentation about sifters. In Wisconsin, we're currently running our burn plans using the Nifter system. The conversion to sifters is something that is being discussed. So the prescriptions, I keep this chart up above my desk, and I look at it when I look at the fire weather in the morning. And if I have weather that falls into this category, I use this chart to start to get an rough idea of whether or not it's a burn day or not. And then once I start to kind of hone in on a day that I think is good, I'll use behave, of course, to kind of fine tune whether or not it's a burn day or not. The mixing heights at 4,300 feet is something that's highlighted in the slide. This was a barrier for us for much of the summer. After burn season was over in the fall, I've reached out to the National Weather Service to get a little bit better idea of how that mixing height number fluctuates over the year. And they didn't have a good number for me on that one. That was something that they don't keep track of. They don't keep records of that. And I need to figure out a way to get a little bit better understanding of how that mixing height value changes over the course of the year. And I'm just kind of build on that a little bit. I'm not exactly sure why the mixing height is set at this level on the property. We're close to a city that has a total population of around 15,000 people in a regional airport. I don't know if that mixing height is going to prevent impacts of that, prevent impacts of those resources or not. Is the value wrong? I guess I really don't know. We receive very few smoke complaints, generally speaking, on our burns. After we burn, I always make a point of asking some people I know who live in that area if they smell smoke. I ask at the local businesses if they get smoked out, and most of the time people either don't notice their smoke or if they do notice their smoke, we've been burning on this property for long enough they have a basic understanding of what's going on. Next slide, Carly. And this is kind of our implementation plan that we use when doing this burn. We rely heavily on perimeter firing in the spring. And for this burn, I had an understanding that we would need to start looking more at center ignitions. But I did not necessarily have a solid understanding of what that one what that would look like. Some things that I fully didn't anticipate for this one. The crew doing center ignitions needed a lot of fuel. Typically on this unit, we're able to complete it using about 10 gallons of drip torch fuel. I think we used about 35 gallons of fuel the day that we did this. And drip torch fuel is by no means a limiting factor for us. I mean, diesel fuel in the big scheme of things is relatively cheap, but moving drip torch fuel around was something that we need to have a little bit better understanding of going forward. This area is not flat, and operating a UTV in the interior is extremely difficult, and it's hard on the equipment. So kind of getting those things kind of honed into something that we need to look a little bit more closely at. Also, you know, walking through the bracken fern in this unit is not something that's we need to think about. So when you look at our list of resources, I think at one time on this burn, we had between 8 and 9 people lighting at one time. Typically in a spring burn, we'd be able to do this with 2 torches. So it is just in that implementation phase, the idea that you need more torches is a big deal. And it's something that maybe I didn't necessarily totally understand going into that. So yeah, but no, this is again, as Carly said, this is a 65 acre burn unit. It's something that we could normally in the spring expect to close in about half a day, and expect it to be 80 to 100% black. And Carly will show some slides a little bit further on down the line that shows that. And that expectation for field staff on what success is, that's something that we need to learn, you know, and we're still getting there. So next slide, please, Carly. So for results, you know, again, the day of the burn, again, that mixing height value was something that we need to get a little bit better head around to see if we can look at reducing those heights. For spring burns, man, perimeter firing is an easy win. Summer burns, they're definitely going to require interior ignitions on this property. Yeah, and then the other thing that we kind of ran into a little bit this go around, and we had a fairly wet summer this year, or this past year, was mop up. In the spring, we could probably have this mopped up successfully within the first day and the morning of the second day. On this unit, we were out mopping up on this unit for 3 consecutive mornings after we did the burn. So it's not a hindrance by any stretch of the word. It's just something to think about when you're putting this together. And again, I understand that we may be more effective burning this time of year, but yeah, but just that understanding going in on what the expectation is for the folks staffing the burn is a good thing to have. Yeah, and then the last thing I got is just with the amount of green that we have on the property, we just need to be willing to consider burning in those drier conditions. So overall, I think the burn was conducted in a very successful manner. We're not sure if we we succeeded in meeting those burn objectives, but that I guess will come in time. So Carly, that's it for me.
Okay, thanks, Henry. So looking at the post-burn kind of the ecological objectives, which I guess is more my wheelhouse. Looking at aspen and other woody vegetation, we achieved 30% aspen top kill and about 50% of our other woody vegetation, which I forgot to mention before is primarily hazel and black cherry. And then we did get some nice aerial photos afterwards and mapped it out in GIS, and our coverage was about 60%. So we met our over 50% goal. The areas where the bracken fern was really dense, you know, Henry mentioned this, but there's some very dense bracken fern in this unit that's 4 feet high and higher where you can't see where you're walking. And those areas really did not burn well, but around the edges it did. And so I guess in the long term, I mean, I don't know what to expect, but if we were to continue growing season burns in this unit, I guess I would hope that that bracken fern patches would be reduced in size over time, kind of chipping away at them from the edges. So we're eager to see what the results are during our growing season this year in 2022, what this unit's going to look like. In the short term, I guess I would hope to see a longer term management of woody vegetation. You know, we repeatedly burn woody vegetation in the spring and it pops back up right away. And I guess I'd like to see maybe some reduction in that, but I don't know what to expect, like Henry said. Long term, with repeated growing season burns, I would hope to see more woody vegetation control and also an overall reduction in bracken fern and maybe even change in species composition in some of these units. So just to touch again on the opportunities and challenges, opportunities, you know, increasing our opportunities to burn, the number of days that we're able to implement prescribed burning on the property, and the number of acres that we're able to burn annually. Like Jack mentioned, this is kind of a paradigm shift, especially for our staff and the local community. This is not, you know, growing season burning is not something we've done here before. So it is going to be a change in expectations, and we don't know yet really what success looks like. So that's kind of interesting. Growing our understanding of how to implement these burns and what to expect on the day of burn and afterward. And opportunities for improved and diversified ecological response. Some of the challenges, again, we didn't know what to expect. This is still new, and we still don't know what to expect for ecological response. So that's something that we hope to monitor in the future. I am planning to set up some long-term monitoring plots throughout the property to monitor the effects of this, but also lots of our other management actions. To get that kind of monitoring established, I think will be really important, and hopefully provide some information on what's working best. You know, we're planning to continue with spring burning. I mean, I still think that's one of our most important and cost-effective tools for managing this property, but I'd like to augment it with more growing season burns. So for this year, for 2022, we are planning another 2 more burn units. Again, these are kind of, I guess I would put them in the easier category where there's less woody vegetation already. It's about 200 acres total, and implementing that long-term monitoring again. So with that, here's our contact information, and thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you so much, Carly and Henry. Just for our panel discussion, we'll have all of our panel presenters turn on their video. We have a quick poll here that's going to be launched to get a sense of where our audience is at with their growing season burn experience. And then as far as time, we'll wrap up this discussion in about 20 minutes so we can get Jennifer Dixon introduced at 1:30. So we're seeing things roll in here. All right, so getting most of our folks have answered. So it's really leaning pretty heavily toward personal experience with growing season burns, which is interesting to see. We're above 50% there, and then kind of split between people who haven't and haven't been involved with prescribed fire at all. So thanks for everyone for participating in that. That's really cool to see. Okay, so it looks like we have all of our presenters on board. I think one thing that really caught my ear here towards the end was as Henry was presenting, talking about some of the barriers. He said it's not a hindrance, but it is something to think about. And so that's a question I wanted to ask, pose to all of you in terms of growing season burns. What has been most helpful for you in getting ready to burn during the growing season, particularly, you know, now that you all have at least one under your belts of the what might have been surprising that you are going to prepare for better next time?
I think for me, it was, I mean, exactly the same thing that Henry touched on, that just knowing that we had to have so much ignition. So making sure that I'm doing a better job of training some of the folks that even don't have a lot of experience, but making sure that I'm doing a lot more training on ignition patterns, and just so that I have that flexibility, so that it doesn't take up so much time, because that was one of our things is during that, and we burned a really small unit. So I can't imagine what it would have been like had we tried to burn something larger. So really being able to increase, because we still had to burn pretty late, start our day pretty. We needed to wait for that RH to drop. So our ignition window was still pretty small.
Yeah, I'll second that. I think we could have probably used even more people on ignitions than we had that day. Mostly just because it's physically tiring to do internal ignitions in the terrain and at this property, and it's warm. So, you know, giving people a break, cycling people in and out, and I think, yeah, looking at different ignition patterns, internal ignition patterns.
As far as getting the program started for summer burning, I think Carly deserves a lot of credit for making that push to force that issue. And so I think Laura and Carly have done a good job talking about firing, but just that initial push to make it happen is what's really critical from my point to make that one go. Don't be afraid to try, and if it doesn't work as well, you learn that too, right? So oftentimes we're pretty focused on acreages that are black, and in my world we get credit for the number of acres burned, and that doesn't necessarily correlate to the number of acres burned successfully. But you know, just that understanding of, you know, what your overall objectives are and taking that initial first step, I think, is something to consider.
I think the other thing too is that there is a burn or prescribed fire community out there that is willing to answer questions. So I know my boss, Tim Gallagher, had a lot of conversations with Jack. I'm assuming Jack was okay with that. So just having those conversations, because we weren't really sure what weather we were looking for. So having those conversations so that we could, you know, start looking at those windows was really helpful.
And again, from years and years of doing this, it was switching from kind of a spring or fall strategy of thinking about, you know, you can move the burns quicker, you can do them quicker, you might be able to do multiple units, to being satisfied with that slow rate of spread, long residence time to get the fire effects. But that's changing to, you know, rotating crews, maybe multiple firing, maybe more internal firing, multiple days. So it's kind of that shift in operations. And it's also that accepting of a different risk level, because the longer you have fire on the ground over multiple days, potentially the more that can go wrong. But again, with the growing season, it's kind of balancing out that risk with thinking about the live fuel. Complacency actually is greater, or loss of situational awareness, I think, is greater in growing season burns, because people see that low fire behavior that you get sometimes, and then they're surprised if it picks up and moves or creeps across a line or produces smoke that you're not aware of.
I think that's a good segue. In our preparation for this, we had a lot of discussion about mop up, and I know that's something Steve was going to talk a little bit more about as well, and kind of what have you learned about fuel consumption and mop up, and maybe especially surprising intensities on the fire line. I'll turn that over to Steve first.
I think what we could have done on ours is we could have just done more monitoring on that instead of less active mop up, but it would have been a commitment of a couple of guys, which it would have ended up to 2 weeks before it rained. So I mean, that's, that becomes a cost factor, you know, when you're in the consulting engine thing, and even if you're an agency doing burning, or, you know, what's your budget? Basically, it was what it comes down to. And, you know, we were overall, you know, looking back and looking once I started going out there in August and taking some look at stuff. I mean, you know, the objective was expose some mineral soil, set back woody vegetation, low shrubby woody vegetation, and we met both of those. You know, it wasn't over 100% of the area, but it was going to be a situation where they were going to do some follow-up seeding, and it met that objective.
I guess for us at Metro Parks, I didn't feel like our mop up was any different than it was. I didn't feel like it was any different than it was during dormant season. I was surprised though at how many of our heavy fuels caught on fire. But I think we also are burning in that kind of urban interface. So we always have a lot of mop up anyways. We don't typically let things burn. I mean, anytime we're burning in a woody situation, we assume that we'll have at least a 2 to 3 day burn. But we don't typically just allow things to burn because I think we're in that urban interface.
Yeah, people are definitely feeling different constraints around that across the region. As Steve, if that's one thing I'm not sure if we caught on your case study, was that a rural area that you were at, or did you have a lot of public or neighbors, or a lot of public interaction there?
No, we were way on the interior of a large hunt club. The nearest structure was 3 miles away. The nearest occupied residence was 5 miles away. And so we had the ideal situation for we could have burnt with any direction wind where we were at, and not impacted anybody. There was a golf course that's about 6 miles away, and it's on a hill that kind of overlooks this long valley where the burn was in. And I stopped there the next day and asked them if they'd seen any smoke or smelled any smoke or had anybody say anything. And they had no idea that we were burning. So.
And my approach with mop up was, and I think you saw on the slides, hopefully people caught that consumptive mop up. If we were working in WUI, or where we had to have it mopped up by a certain time, or where there was potential smoke impacts, you know, then we didn't want to allow that consumptive mop up, you know, meaning let stuff burn out. We more actively mopped it up. And so I really paid attention more to the 10, 100, 1,000 hour fuels and the duff layer, so that we didn't put fire in there when we were going to get heavier stuff going. So that reduced the mop up. And you have the ability to do that in the growing season more, because you can kind of play with that live fuel moisture too, and look at where that duff moisture is at. When we were in more rural areas where we didn't have smoke impacts and could let it burn out for days, then I had a flow chart that we used for figuring out the level of perimeter mop up we needed. And after that, it was setting up rotating patrols of people. So maybe 2 people a day would go out and just kind of monitor it and make sure that we didn't miss anything in the perimeter mop up, but let the heavies burn out inside, because that made the next time it was burned, much easier. And it was also the comparison of, you know, the severity. You know, there's both positive and negative effects from burning up really heavy fuels and burning that organic layer and duff layer down.
I will say too, we've developed really strong relationships with our local fire departments, and that has been huge for us. And I actually did the same site where we did the growing season burn that spring. We did a burn in that area also, and that area burned again because I had a spot fire that got away from us. So I actually did have to call the fire department And I thought for sure that that would start to ruin our relationship. But it actually strengthened it, because basically he said, no, this is what we've been working toward. This worked. You had a problem, you called us, we showed up, you didn't allow the problem to get bigger. So in the end, it really strengthened that relationship with the fire department versus creating a negative experience.
Okay. So we had some questions about smoke, and in terms of that impacting the community and outreach and being kind of a visible part of your burns. So it sounds like that has been really variable depending on where you're at. But since we had quite a bit of discussion about that during the preparations, I wanted to see if anyone wanted to elaborate more on smoke, or have a chance for Trent to address any questions about that too.
So just in terms of smoke management for Carly and myself, we have a list of people that we call every morning before we burn. So we call the local fire chiefs, we call the local sheriff's departments in 2 different states to let them know we're up to, and we call a lot of local town officials. And I didn't start that process. The supervisor before me started that process. It's been something that's been done for the last 30 years when we burn on that property, and just that long-term connection with those folks has really paid a dividend. Just that brief connection, and those conversations, they don't take but a minute. It's like, oh, you're burning again. Okay, well, be careful. That's basically what the average conversation is. But just that building of that long-term relationship with those local units of government, it has paid a huge dividend for us. And then just the way we operate locally here, we have the police or the fire department frequencies in our trucks. We always check in and out with the dispatcher when we go out of service for the night on a prescribed burn. So just those local contacts have paid us a huge dividend in terms of mitigating that smoke. That smoke.
That's a really good example. I've been involved with burning on the Moqua Barrens in Bayfield area for years and years and years. And yeah, they kind of know the gig now. They're like, yep. And also they get good blueberries out of it, so they like that too. We publish blueberry maps based on the fire history, and talk about, whatever it takes to, make friends is good. I was just going to mention one thing, and I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I thought it was a good example of something that obviously everybody's learning, and folks, Carly and Henry are working on their stuff, but they talked about their mixing height limit that they have. And I think that's an example. I was trying to make an analogy, but you guys were talking before about just in general, Jack and others, about being specific on fire effects. Like, what are you actually burning for? And I would say that's kind of a thing with this. It's like, what are you specifically trying to do with that mixing height? I think, as we talk some more, we could probably configure your air quality limitations to be more specific to what you're actually, trying to prevent, if it's Iron Mountain or whatever, the issues are, and then get away from something that's such a blanket restriction and getting something more specific that still addresses the concern that you have. So I think all those things, as we learn more, we can be more specific in what we're trying to get at, and then it potentially opens up windows. So.
We also have some questions in the chat asking, have you seen any pressures from wildlife groups or organizations that prefer not to see growing season burns, and how you approach those conversations?
I'd say in Florence County, I get occasional emails about spring burning, but I did not get anything or hear anything about growing season burns. We do public notice in the local paper when the burn season is coming up, and I don't know if that alleviates any of that or not, but for the most part, I think our local folks just go about their business and don't really pay much attention to what's going on, other than, oh, they're burning today. So.
So at Metro Parks, we have a very active and vocal birding community. Pretty much it doesn't matter what we do, we can't make them happy. So, I mean, our theory is just being honest about everything that we say, inviting them to as many things as we can. And for us, it's also about just making sure we have the research, so that if we have research and we can back up what we're doing. They do a ton, our birding community does a lot of research in our metro parks. So we have the research to back it up. And so that just allows us to have those honest, that honest communication.
And when I was with TNC in Michigan, I mean, just about everything we burned or touched had a threatened or endangered species or a bunch. So, you know, part of it was we always had to get the permits, and we worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, consultation, Section 7 consultation. We worked with the state biologists. We never were restricted because we approached it very carefully. We helped establish some of the guidelines for kind of like the acreage or the way to kind of burn in habitat in different seasons because of that. In most cases, you know, the populations responded. You know, I'm certainly going to tell you, yes, we did kill some individuals of species, but looking back, there wasn't any difference in whether we did that in dormant season or growing season. So, you know, we always approached it as carefully as we could, but recognizing that the improvement of the habitat far outweighed the individual loss. And I'm not trying to be cold-hearted. That's just the fact that we all deal with. If you don't do any management, you're still going to have loss. So.
And I will say, like with this growing season burn, we were hoping that it would be potentially better for, because of the habitat we were burning in, we were hoping that our box turtles wouldn't be in that habitat at that time. We do a lot of monitoring with the Toledo Zoo. They do a lot of box turtle monitoring. And this was, again, a 15-acre burn, and we still had one box turtle mortality. So just like Jack's saying, it really doesn't seem to matter when we burn. You're always selecting for specific species, and you're going to get some mortality, but more important is improving the habitat.
All right, well, thank you for all those answers. I think it does highlight kind of where burning issues came from, as well as that a lot of these managers and the management community in general is managing very rich or high quality areas, or trying to push them toward better wildlife habitat. And yeah, we keep seeing these conflicts between or trade-offs between the negative impacts to the individuals and the overall improvement to the habitat. So thanks for addressing those, and I'm sure it will continue to be a topic for future years of burning issues as well. With that, I do want to acknowledge in the chat there's some more specific questions. Some of those are being followed up with some links and resources, but we're also saving the chat and can address some of those specific questions as well. As my closing question for folks is that, you know, now that you've kind of been through one or more iterations of growing season burning, opening the burning window, and have started to learn some of the lessons for yourself, how are you getting a lot of inquiries from your colleagues about how things went, and kind of what's your strategy for sharing what you've learned, if it's the appropriate time to do so? Maybe you need to learn more. That's my closing question.
I know here in Wisconsin, we put together a press release, and it wasn't just for Northeast Wisconsin, but it was for growing season burns throughout the state, just trying to increase public awareness and hopefully awareness amongst our colleagues as well. And the Natural Resources Foundation in Wisconsin put a bit of a spin on it too, as a kind of a climate adaptation, you know, opening the window and increasing our opportunities to burn. So there was some public recognition or, notice in that regard. And yeah, just kind of talking with local colleagues and trying to show people that this is an option, so.
All right, well, we'll give Carly the last word then. So I want to thank all of you for preparing for this and accepting our invitation. I think it's you've shared a lot of really good lessons and the experience behind that. So thanks again to all of our presenters, and we'll be posting recordings and perhaps copies of the presentations coming up in the future. So please keep an eye out for that. And then we'll get ready for our final presentation today. So just as we're transitioning here, next up we have Jennifer Dixon. She is the Air Quality Liaison for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy's Air Quality Division. She has worked with the Department on air quality and related issues since 1999. She's known as the Open Burning Lady of Michigan and has worked closely with fire departments and other state agencies on issues around open burning. So thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Craig. I'm not sure about the passion that you gave that Open Burning Lady of Michigan, kind of caveat there. So, yep, I'm Jennifer. Nice to meet everyone. Really appreciate being invited to talk today. It's been very interesting from the perspective of our agency as a regulatory agency. So, our typical focus is on industrial air pollution and controlling that, making sure that those emissions meet rules and regulations under the Clean Air Act. So our, expanse into burning things is a very complicated thing. And it feels like it shouldn't be a lot of times, but it very much is. So and the reason I had Craig introduce me as the Open Burning Lady of Michigan is because there's a very entertaining educational video where I get to be the superstar of it. It's my only, 5 seconds of fame ever in the world, but I will share that resource with you just so you guys can get a laugh out of it. I hope it's supposed to be a little kitschy and also just get the message out there that open burning regulations are complicated in Michigan. And this doesn't necessarily apply to prescribed burns, but it definitely has some impact on public perception of burning in general in Michigan. And because you folks are familiar, I think a lot of you with the state, you understand that our perception of burning in the Upper Peninsula and the Upper LP is much different than our perception of burning in the Lower Peninsula, the bottom part of the LP. So that's even indicative of how you see if burning is allowed and how you get a burn permit across the state. The upper part of Michigan is basically like, check the map, can you burn? The lower part of Michigan is you got all kinds of different things and hoops you might have to jump through to be able to burn on a specific day. But what I wanted to focus on today, because obviously I don't have prescribed burn experience, but I wanted to bring in front of you all the fact that, which was kind of news to me. And when I claim my claim to fame as the Open Burning Lady, and I say I wasn't really aware that we had this smoke management plan, I don't know, maybe you guys will just throw this talk out the window, but I was very interested to learn that we do have a specific smoke management plan. And the reason I wanted to call this talk, is it still relevant, is because the plan itself was developed by some of the speakers that you just heard. They definitely worked on it. Steve and Trent worked on it, and I think some other folks too, so I apologize if I'm not naming everybody. But it was written in 2007-ish, and so that makes it quite old, almost older than my children. So it's old. And although there's a lot of good information in it, I think it bears thinking about whether or not it's something that we should still be using holistically or if there's changes. So I don't want to give you a whole lesson on the plan itself because it's right before lunch and I only have a half hour and I don't want everybody hanging up on me. So I'm gonna try to keep this sort of short, sweet, high level, give you sort of the, my takeaways from talking to people, interviewing some of our district supervisors that have worked with folks that do prescribed burning in Michigan, and it's kind of lumping a lot of that together. So as you guys have heard this morning from everybody, is that smoke management is important. It's a really important part of any burn that you do. And obviously the reason why it's important is because we want to sort of balance those ecological benefits with potential increases in emissions. And that is a real thing. And people are becoming more and more aware of that as we go through time. Over my career here with the Air Quality Division and with Eagle, people have become more aware of it. The majority of my job is not being the open burning lady of Michigan. It is actually dealing with controversial emission sources, industrial sources. So anytime, I know Kalamazoo there's folks from Kalamazoo on the line. So the graphic packaging situation there in Kalamazoo, I play a big role in how we communicate those situations. There was a Stellantis or a Chrysler facility in Detroit that we recently had a big meeting on, so outreach is a really, really big part of my job. And although we don't do a ton of outreach for burning, we do quite a bit. So we work a lot in conjunction with our Department of Natural Resources to make sure that our messaging is appropriate. So we do want to make sure that we're at least aware that these are things that people are going to have concerns about, and we're trying to find that good balance with all the things that you guys have talked about. So this smoke management plan in general has some kind of high level purposes. So they're very well laid out. And as I was going through them, I thought, yeah, this totally makes sense. So during smoke management, of course, you want to protect human health and prevent exceedance of the national ambient air quality standards. So we'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. And I think you guys are aware, but I want to just make sure we're kind of focusing on some of those things. Of course, we want to mitigate public nuisance and safety hazards. So when folks see smoke, they're going to either call their fire department, which of course it's good for them to know that a burn is going on, or they're going to call Eagle because they don't know who regulates these kinds of things and it's bothering them. So we obviously want to keep that in mind. We want to especially reduce smoke in public areas. So we'll talk a little bit about how this smoke management plan might inform a site-specific plan that you might put together before you actually do a burn. We want to definitely minimize those visibility impacts on class 1 areas, which we do have some in Michigan. So we want to make sure that we're doing that as well. And then we want to make sure that we're providing a basis for smoke management practices so that people are doing them consistently across the state consistently for burns, at least as much as possible. So this is, educating folks about something maybe we haven't really talked about. And then we want to make sure that we're continuing to have prescribed burns as an ecological management practice so that we're not getting into a bind with some of our friends in certain areas that are pushing back on these and trying to prevent them from happening at all. So I want to talk a little bit about what is our role, what is our sort of regulatory role in prescribed burns, and then what part do we play in the smoke management. So our overall sort of role is managing the Clean Air Act portions that are in Michigan. So we want to make sure that we're helping folks that do prescribe burns follow the rules and regulations that apply. We want to obviously make sure that we're maintaining air quality that is healthy for our residents and healthy for the environment. And then, of course, we want to also make sure that those visibility considerations for the class 1 areas are taken into consideration. So from a high level standpoint, that is what we're concerned about. How do we play a role in that? Well, obviously, y'all are the ones that really play the biggest role, but I think you've heard that sort of spirit of cooperation be talked about a lot this morning. So we want to make sure that there's an awareness of the smoke management plan. Internally, obviously, and externally. And I'll just as a sidebar say, hey, I talked to my management folks and I was like, hey, do you guys know that we have this? And they were all like, what, Jennifer, we have this? And I said, yeah, we have this. it's a great tool. We should be making sure we talk about it and we should be looking at it. So then I think that next step to kind of the acknowledgement that it exists is that we need to be a partner in implementing that. So I'm not exactly sure what that looks like. I have some ideas that I'll throw out here at the end of the presentation, but because I only have a half hour and I know you guys don't want to just hear me blather on forever, I'll try to keep that short. So rules and regulations talked a lot about, or a little bit about the NAAQS. We call those the NAAQS, those National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So those apply to the criteria pollutants, but in the case of burning, we're looking more at things that are products of combustion. So specifically particulates are going to be that most obvious thing. We're required to meet the NAAQS. And if we don't meet the NAAQS, which has happened in the past, and we do have some, they're called non-attainment areas in certain parts of Michigan right now for ozone and sulfur dioxide, we can have sanctions against us. So sort of easiest one to think about is right now in the parts of Michigan that are not in attainment for ozone, there is a very serious consideration of us being what they call bumped up, which really is sort of like leveling us down and making things harder for us by requiring tailpipe emissions testing like they do in some other states. So we don't have that here now. But because of this, it could be required in certain parts of the state, and ozone being a regional pollutant that travels around, it's something, a way that they try to tackle that. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. We've already talked about those class 1 areas. So we also have a couple other rules that probably aren't as familiar to people. Rule 301 is our visible emissions rule. Basically what this rule says is that visible emissions from anything have to be less than 20% opacity. And this does really apply to burns, although it's not typically implemented in burns. So even if we would get a complaint about a prescribed burn exceeding opacity limits, we probably wouldn't write a violation notice. Now, if that opacity and that increase in smoke is impacting residents, there is a potential for that. So that's just something to consider. I wanted to just put it out there that there is a rule that applies to that. And if folks have questions about what is opacity, let me know, but I figure you guys know. And then we do have air toxics regulations. So these are just other things besides those sort of main pollutants that we would be concerned with, like particulates, that we would also be concerned with that do come from burning wood, like benzene, formaldehyde, acrolein, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So these are just kind of the rules and regulations that apply to burning in general. Another thing that we want to just think about when we're thinking about the NAAQS is, what does the air quality look like in Michigan now? So this is a big part of the smoke management plan, is kind of assessing what are your current conditions and then what could those conditions be after the burn. So you've heard folks talk about that a lot in their sort of case studies this morning, but this is a picture from yesterday. So this is yesterday, particulates and ozone across Michigan. So you can see that usually when we see these brighter colors, we think, danger, danger. Well, Robinson, watch out. So this is just something to be aware of. If you aren't looking at the Air Now site, you should be. It is an important part of planning, I think. And when we have a lot of folks that are very savvy about the AQI now, the air quality index, and what it means. And I'll show you a little thing earlier and just kind of talk about how this interacts with the smoke management plan in a second. But just to let you know that in the winter time, obviously we have weather patterns that will tend to have us have more impacts from particulate matter. So speaking of that, when we're talking about smoke management plans, when you're developing a site-specific plan, what are things that you should really consider? And I know that you guys know this, and I know you've heard about it, but I just want to mention it because it's actually in the overall smoke management plan, is obviously looking at the weather. So what does your atmospheric ventilation look like? Considering the lake effect. I know folks talked about our bigger lakes that we have here, and then our larger inland lakes that can all cause varying weather conditions that can have impacts on your burns. Use those fire forecasting tools that you have at your fingertips to at least do the best you can to make an assessment on the day of your burn and leading up to it. So, and this is just something else, obviously, that you guys all know because you're more familiar with burns, but longer burns on larger amounts of acreage obviously have more potential for elevated interest, for elevated pollution, for elevated smoke. So you just want to make sure that you're considering all those factors when you're going into your burn. All right, so this plan specifically asks burners to do 4 main things. And so because it's in the plan, I want to just talk about each one of them a little bit individually. So we want to work to minimize fire emissions. And the reason is because we want to make sure we're in compliance with all those rules and regulations, that we're not impacting public health, that we're not impacting the environment in a negative way from air pollution. You guys are in control of what species are being propagated and what ones are kind of on the wayside as far as that goes. Notify the public and other affected parties. So I heard some really interesting conversation about that. And I think I have a little bit different perspective on some of it, but I'll also say that I really agree with a lot of the steps that you guys are taking to make sure that the message gets out there to folks. I'm sorry, I have a cat in front of me, of course. But I thought it was really interesting, and I just wanted to talk about this really quickly. Actually, I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's go over these first. So the third thing is to evaluate smoke dispersion and then to monitor air quality. So we've talked a little bit about that. Let's talk a little bit more in detail what the plan is asking for. So when you're doing a site-specific plan for smoke management, of course, you want to include those really high-level things: who, what, where, when, and how. That's always should be part of the plan. You want to estimate your fuel loading. You guys know how to do that. You want to have your fire prescription, including your smoke management components. So this is going to be really where this plan comes in. And then what criteria does the fire manager use to create a no-go, a go, no-go situation or decision? So, when do you push those boundaries? When is it okay to say no? Those kinds of things. And then obviously make sure that you have contingency plans if you do start getting big smoke intrusions or complaints from neighbors, is how I always think of that. Always think of that. So when we're talking about working to minimize emissions, what I want you guys to consider, and you talked about this a little bit before too, I know Trent brought this up specifically, is to consider the impacts of sensitive populations. So in situations that Steve talked about, where you're 5 miles from this person and you're 3 miles from this person, that's probably not as big of a deal. But when other folks talked about sort of those urban area burns, these are really, really important. So not only do you have residential areas near you, but you do need to consider hospitals, parks, travel routes, other places where people gather. And I always think about it in a way like, if people can see it and they don't know what it is, they're going to question it. And typically they're going to go to a worst case scenario situation in their heads. And they're going to want to know what's going on. And they're going to want to know if it's legal. And they're going to want somebody to tell that they have burning eyes or their house smells like smoke or whatever the case may be. So this is going to be just a really important factor in deciding when and where and how to do your burn. And then you should include in your plan your distance and directions to all those potential preceptors. So we do this whenever we have crushing operations where, I've seen ones where they've just like drawn a circle on a map and drew lines and put distances into schools and commercial properties and things like that, just to make sure that they're not going to be impacting those areas. And then of course you want to avoid visibility impacts in class 1 areas, but then also consider other areas like parks and things like that, where you're going to have people coming, especially when you're doing sort of those off-season burns that you guys have been talking about. So talking about notifying the public and other affected parties, I just want to talk briefly about, I was sitting here listening, and when I heard Trent first say, own your smoke, and I was like, what, own your smoke? That sounds horrible. But then as I listened to why Trent said that, I thought, you know what, that is a great point. And so I'm giving you some kudos out there, Trent. And I don't know if I would put it that way when I'm talking to the public, but I feel like that is a really important part to acknowledging the fact that what you're doing is working to balance those ecological needs and also protecting the environment and public health. So it's talking about the fact that this isn't an arbitrary thing. Burns take planning, burns take a lot of consideration, all the things that go into that, and sort of advertising it, talking about it, meeting with the right people, considering not just your local and state authorities and your fire departments and things like that, but stuff like Wisconsin talked about as far as putting out a press release. We aren't in control of who picks that up, but it is really important for local people to know that these things are going on and why, not just that they're going on, but I think why is it important to the person that lives there? Why is it important to the plant and animal species that are in this certain area? This is just something, it should be part of your plan. And so whenever I deal with these controversial issues that I deal with, I always write a communications plan, and you guys would not want to do that because they're typically like 5 to 7 pages long. And that's just about how we're going to communicate things. But it is a thing to consider. And if we do get complaints about things or people are questioning, you can say, look, we did this kind of outreach. This is how we tried to talk to community about what was going on. And you're going to have different ways that you want to do that depending on what the community is that you're dealing with. So obviously evaluate smoke dispersion. You guys have talked a lot about this today. You want to just make sure that you are using your available resources. So just to throw another one out there that maybe hasn't necessarily been talked about, but our Eagle meteorologists are really well versed in a lot of this. And if there is a question on shouldn't, what do you think of this? Do you have some more, area specific data that you could share with us? They would be more than open to doing that. So I wanted to just throw that out there also as a potential resource. And then monitoring air quality. So this is going to come in a few different things. So obviously you're going to be doing your own visual observations. There's nothing sometimes better than the naked eye to do that. And when we talk about opacity, when you're getting more smoke than you thought you should be getting, than what you're used to, or than what's typical. So you want to make sure you're doing those visible observations and that you can make changes on the fly if needed, and that you're prepared to do that. You want to make sure that if it's appropriate, especially for the larger burns, that you are trying to do some of that real-time monitoring. I was talking about maybe the Purple Air, which has a really great map and is really cool when it comes to particulate matter, and folks are really into that and they know about it. So if you have a burn where people are getting impacted or there's complaints, that might be something that they ask you. Well, did you monitor for particulates? Did you put a monitor here? What's the closest air quality monitor? And I will say, at least in Michigan, we really only have one stationary monitor in the UP, and that's at Seney, and it doesn't measure a lot. And so it's not really that useful for a lot of things. So just kind of keep that in mind. Again, I just wanted to share this picture that folks are very versed in, the public is very versed in seeing these. And whenever we get this moderate or anything above that for people, they get concerned and we get calls. So if you look at the map now of Michigan, we still have these sort of situations going on. The smoke management plan for Michigan in general doesn't talk about a line. Where is that line on the AQI where you shouldn't burn? There's nothing that says if it's, over 100, the AQI is over 100, you shouldn't burn the next day. There's nothing that says that. I would argue maybe you want to really take that into consideration because, like I said, those stronger colors, the stronger the color, the more alarmed people get when things are going on in their area. So especially for this one, this one specifically is looking at this finer particulate matter, which are the ones that get in your lungs and in bed and can cause a lot of problems. People don't know how to differentiate smoke from a prescribed burn to those kinds of things. So it's a perception issue too. Just a little bit more about the AQI. Again, in the plan, it does not say thou shall not burn if the AQI is this, that, or the other. But I wanted to just share this because once you get to orange, we really start encouraging people that are sensitive or that have underlying health effects to not go outside. So I think burning on days where it's orange, and I think this is sort of mentioned in the plan, just as I said, maybe a guide, consider not doing it that day. It's just, from a public perception standpoint and from a real live health standpoint, this can be detrimental to sensitive populations. So here we go. And how are we implementing this plan? I wanted to do a poll question that was like, hey, who knows about this plan? Who follows this plan? I know Steve follows the plan. Steve is definitely a plan follower. So thank you, Steve. I talked to some of my district supervisors and they were like, yeah, we hear from Steve. He lets us know when he's doing a burn in our district. So that's great. But really the plan, at least from an Eagle standpoint, is getting, are we notified? Because that helps us deal with complaints that might come in. So if we get a complaint, we can say, oh no, so-and-so is doing a prescribed burn there. It's to manage this, that, or the other. And we can help you message that in a positive way. So are we seeing plans come in? Not really. I mean, that happens sometimes, but not always, not consistently. This overall smoke management plan in and of itself was supposed to be reviewed biannually. I don't think that's happened because from 2007. So that is probably something that we should do. I feel like there's definitely some updating that needs to be done. It also suggests a web-based tracking system, which to me, because I'm kind of like a nerd when it comes to maps, I'm a huge nerd when it comes to maps. Okay, I'm just going to put that out there, and you guys don't tell it anybody, but I am a huge nerd when it comes to maps. We have a really cool system that is GIS interface, and I think it could be really cool for this. So talking behind the scenes on maybe getting that up and running for us in collaboration with our Michigan Department of Natural Resources. So just talked to one of my coworkers over there yesterday. I was like, hey, what do you think about this? I think we could totally do it. So that could be happening as it is required in the plan, which we have not done. So for future considerations, and this is going to be, I'm kind of wrapping it up because I want to watch the time. I know you guys want to eat lunch, and I know I'm talking super fast, but for future considerations with the plan, just another thing to put out there is that EPA is considering reducing the NAAQS for PM 2.5. So what that means is that we will have to meet a lower number in order to be in compliance. We're meeting that number right now. But if they lower the number, it's just going to become more challenging, especially when we're taking into consideration things like this. What other monitoring devices could we recommend that might help ensure that we're still meeting air quality and we're still being protective of those we need to be protective of? Do complaints indicate needed changes? So we do sometimes get complaints about prescribed burns. They're typically smoke related, and a lot of times what's really challenging is that if we don't know that it's a burn, then it takes a lot of staff time and resources to see what's going on. So that's where sort of that notification comes into play. Does the AQI indicate needed changes? So should we put some maybe less gray lines in the plan so that folks that are doing burns have a better guide and the public feels more protected by what's going on? Are there other stakeholders that we should be including in this planning process? Does the plan need to be updated? I think, yes, that's definitely true. And then that web-based platform that I talked about a second ago, I definitely think that that needs to be done. And then are there other tools that we can help burn managers meet the requirements? So is there a template, a notification template, if we can't get this online system? Is there sort of a outline of a plan that we would expect or that would be helpful for staff to be able to get, and it's easy for you all to submit to us, that kind of thing. So just a lot to kind of consider as we walk through this. I will share this back with Andy and Craig and those guys so that they can share. I just put together some of the resources that I talked about in my presentation in case you want them. This one right here, the open burning in Michigan, has a ton of resources, but it also has that really nice video that I know you guys are going to want to check out. So anyway, and also I'm in a competition with one of my coworkers on who has the most views on their video. So if you guys could watch it, that would be great. That's my plug. I see that you guys have some questions or comments potentially in the chat. So I will stop chatting, and Craig, if you want to throw some at me, feel free.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was fantastic. I think it's mostly just comments there and a lot of appreciation and people sharing things. So if there are any final questions, we'll allow a moment here for people to throw those into the chat. But
I did have one question, Andy, regarding the carbon emissions of prescribed fires and how to discuss that with the public.
Oh, that's a good one. I don't know that I have any really great light bulb moments at this time, but I think that's a really good one for consideration to sort of put in that list of like, what other things do we need to talk about? resources to help burn managers talk about those kinds of things that are consistent across the board might be really, really helpful. Yeah, I'm gonna make a note about that. Like I said, I don't have any light bulbs right now. You know, it's hard because it's not a criteria pollutant, so it's not something that's going to be covered in the NACs or that we can really point to and say you're fine or you're not fine. So that's a really, really good question.
Yeah, and I will add that in the chat, there was a lot of other resources and trying to kind of discuss the relative emissions for prescribed fires versus wildfires that could happen, you know, after a prescribed fire has preceded it, or, you know, the considerations. But
well, we had a really interesting conversations with a lot of our environmental groups this past year because of the wildfire events that have been taking place and the fact that we did need to file, well, we decided to, I guess we didn't need to file an exceptional events request with EPA for some of our non-attainment areas. And that was a big deal because environmental groups are like, this isn't exceptional anymore. These wildfire events, not prescribed burns, but the wildfire events, they're not exceptional anymore. They happen every year. They're always going to impact us because of weather patterns. And so why do we get to say it's exceptional? And why do we get to benefit from not requiring other reductions to make sure that public health and the environment are protected? So it's a really, really interesting part of the conversation that I think that, you know, needs to be incorporated maybe in some of this, at least from an overall standpoint. And Keith, I just saw your comment that it was updated in 2012, but regardless, so that was a long time ago. So, but yeah, definitely needs to update it. And I know we're at time, Andy, so I'm gonna stop blathering now.
Well, we really, really appreciate it. And thank you so much for that presentation. I think everyone enjoyed it. All right. So to wrap up here real quick, just one more appreciation of all of our speakers and panelists today. Specifically today, Steve Cross, Jennifer Dixon, Carly Lappin and Henry Sullivan, Jack, Lorraine and Trent, all fantastic presentations, and hopefully everyone enjoyed that. Would real quickly here, not going to spend a lot of time, and we will get you out, you know, maybe 5 minutes late here. So if we can hang on, just a little bit of an update on the Prescribed Fire Council's annual, an annual update for 2021. We kind of initiated this year with a survey of the barriers to our mission, our overall mission of protecting, conserving, and expanding the safe use of prescribed fire across our state. And I think really what we learned from that is that there was really 3 things that stood out, that being fire training availability and qualification standards, liability legislation and risk management, and limited resources for prescribed fire overall. And so those have really been the guiding, those 3 things have been kind of what has guided us as a steering committee, and the things that we've chosen to pour our attention to. And I would argue that the unfunded state certified burn manager program largely falls within that liability legislation and risk management category for a variety of reasons that we'll learn more about tomorrow. And so perhaps jumps that category up to number 1. But with that, I'll just give you some real brief highlights of kind of the things that we have collectively accomplished this year. I do think that we've made slow and steady progress on Michigan's Certified Burn Manager program, and we will learn more about that tomorrow. We've offered some trainings and have a lot more planned. I think COVID has gotten in our way with that, but we are working towards some statewide coordination of those efforts. And so hopefully we can get that coordinated through our website and kind of have a centralized depot where those things can be offered and advertised. We're also facilitating or have facilitated grants to establish fire collaboratives, or some people refer to them as prescribed burn associations. And I think the council can serve as a really good platform for some cooperations to develop across maybe a lot of smaller NGOs that can work together to pool resources and to really meet their needs that maybe they're not able to address individually. Also got a grant from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources that largely led that effort to work on some oak fire videos and field days. So watch out for those things that will be occurring in the future, but we're initiating planning process on that. Also have worked to coordinate volunteer opportunities in prescribed fire through our website. So you can find that information there. Want to point that out specifically. And then also, I think a really big development here has been the addition of some hourly staff within the council. So Stephanie Deep out of the Kalamazoo Nature Center handles our finances, communications. So hopefully you've seen a lot more social media activity and email communications. That's all Stephanie, and we really, really appreciate her efforts there, as well as all the logistics, underlying Eventbrite pages and that kind of thing for these events. All Stephanie. So we really appreciate that and think that that's an advancement there. Our finances are in good shape. And then also, every year, kind of concluding with this burning issues symposium or workshop, I think is a really good accomplishment. But I will conclude this by saying that this is largely an ad hoc group that needs you. And so ways to support us definitely includes, first and foremost, just joining us in our mission. Membership in that Fire Council's steering committee is quite open, and we would encourage anyone with interest to join that in terms of the leadership and being involved in the various subcommittees there. Also, you can monetarily support us through both some fancy swag that we have available for purchase on the website, as well as just straight up donating online. So I do want to point that out. And then finally, just a real quick, before we part here, tomorrow's agenda will begin with a session devoted to the Brittle Fire that I think will be a really interesting look into that event and the lessons that all of us as a fire community can learn from it. And then we will get into the Certified Burn Manager program with a presentation led by Glenn Palmgren to give us a sense of the past, present, and future of that program, and then jump into a panel discussion. And so I think please join us for tomorrow. It should be a great time. So with that, I will once again thank the organizers on the planning committee for this event. And thank you all for your attendance and attending our 8th annual Burning Issues Workshop, as well as the 22nd annual meeting of the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council. Please note that we'll post all these recordings, and yeah, we'll see everyone tomorrow. Thank you very, very much.